What's up YouTube? Cody Bidlow with SprintingWorkouts.com. In my last video we talked about how you can use force velocity profiling to figure out whether or not you have a force or a velocity deficit in your acceleration and how you can utilize that information to go about planning a training program. Today we're going to go a little bit more down the strength side of things and give you an idea of how, depending on whether you're working with beginner, intermediate, or advanced athletes, or you yourself fit in one of those categories, how training is going to be different for each of those groups. We're going to cover it in more of a, kind of a big picture type of view. We're not going to get too much into the weeds, but I think this can help set you up with kind of a mental framework that'll be helpful for you when you go about building a program, either for you or the athletes you work with. So depending on the experience level of the athletes you're working with or yourself, that's going to dictate how much of which category of exercise is going to be used in the program. We have general preparatory exercises. Those are going to be things that are very general in nature. They won't use the same movement patterns as the main sport. They might even use different muscle groups and systems like energy systems, but they do build underlying qualities of fitness, general whole body strength, mobility, and things like that. Specific preparation exercises are still going to be typically things you'll see done in the weight room or maybe with a med ball, but they're going to be more relevant to preparing the athlete for what they do on the track or in their sport than a general prep exercise. A specific prep exercise is something like maybe a power clean, a box jump, a walking lunge with a barbell. It could be a single leg box jump. Basically, non-specific exercises that are relevant to the main event that you're doing or the main sport that you're playing, but they are not, directly connected to what that ultimate thing is that you do in sport. So as a sprinter, a lunge or a split squat, it's relevant to sprinting, but it's really not specific to sprinting. It might use a similar position, but it's not the same exact motion. It'll use similar muscle groups. It might use similar energy systems. That's what the specific preparation exercises are. You can think of these as kind of the typical exercises that you'll see used in a track athlete's weight room program. Specific development exercises are going to be things that develop the competitive exercise. So say you run the 100-meter dash, an SDE for you could be something like a 30-meter sprint from blocks. It could be a 10-meter sled pull, 20-meter flies, speed endurance training. Basically, you're taking the competitive exercise and you're breaking it down into its component parts. And SDEs might also use some form of overload, like a resisted sprint using a sled, running into the wind, maybe an overspeed training device. Those are all examples of specific development exercises, your SDEs. Your CEs, your competitive exercises, are going to be just the thing you do in competition. So a 100-meter dash sprint from blocks, 60-meter dash sprint from blocks, maybe a shot put with the weight that you would use in competition. Those are your competitive exercises. Now, what proportion of the program is made up of these, different groups of exercises is going to vary based on the level of athlete. Beginners are going to predominantly use general preparatory exercises because they have to build those fundamental foundational qualities of physical output. So they need to build very general strength, whole body strength. They need to be working every muscle group in the body, every possible movement that they could come up with, every vector of force. Those all need to be trained in beginner athletes. So they're going to use upwards of 70% general prep exercises in their training program, and then maybe a little bit of SPEs and SDEs in the competitive exercise. But in general, the bulk of their training is going to be general. With intermediate athletes, it sort of will shift somewhat towards specificity, but they're still going to have a lot of general training in their program. Say you're a high school athlete who's been training for a few years, you should still be doing a whole lot of circuits, a whole lot of just general exercises, because you still have a lot of room to develop using those. Now, with a more advanced athlete, they're no longer really gaining anything from doing those general prep exercises, but they still keep them in the program to a smaller degree because those are going to help maintain health, mobility, fitness, and all that stuff. Advanced athletes are going to shift their training program more toward specific prep exercises and even more so toward specific development exercises, because at that point in their career, improving their back squat is probably not going to make them run much faster. Improving a low box step up might be somewhat relevant, so you'll still do it in the program. You might still do a back squat, but it's not going to take up a lot of the percentage of the volume that you're doing. And instead, more of your efforts are going to be dedicated toward things like a sled pull, like an overspeed or resisted sprint, like speed endurance work, The more specific development exercises, those are what's going to be used more so by advanced athletes rather than just focusing on general training. Now, how this might look in an actual training program could be broken down like this. Note that this is not a prescription or something that you should copy exactly, but this is an example of how, one might look at how a program for a beginner versus intermediate and advanced athletes might be broken down using these different categories of exercises. So for beginner athletes, we have under the general prep exercises, we have bodyweight circuits, core circuits, kettlebell and dumbbell lifts, and tempo runs. Similar for the intermediate and advanced athletes. The only difference is that the intermediate athletes might use regular barbell lifts. That's why I put general lifts instead of just using kettlebells and dumbbells like the beginner athlete might. And then other than that, really quite the same. Intermediate and advanced athletes might benefit more from adding in med ball circuits rather than just bodyweight circuits. Still, the types of training and types of exercises that they'll use are all going to be very similar. It's just the proportion of the program that general prep takes up is going to be much less for advanced athletes. It's going to be used more for maintenance, maybe at the end of a session or on a low intensity day, whereas it's going to take up the bulk of the program for a beginner and a lot of the program for an intermediate athlete. Specific prep exercises for these different categories of athletes are going to start to look a little bit more different. So for a beginner athlete, specific prep exercises might be medicine ball throws, where you're throwing them as far as you can for good power output. They might use step-ups with high and medium-sized boxes, so that way the load that they're going to use is lower. They're going through a full range of motion, and it's more general, but it's still a specific prep exercise. They might use in-place hops and still want to do some hamstring, hip, and calf exercises just like everybody else. For intermediate athletes, the specific prep exercises will shift a little bit. Instead of med ball throws, maybe they're doing power cleans. Instead of a high box step-up, maybe they're doing a medium box step-up. So things are shifting a little bit more specific or a little bit more intense or complex, but they're still, within this range of being specific prep exercises. Instead of only doing in-place hops, maybe they do hops and box jumps, and they still want to be doing hamstring, calf, and hip exercises, so that way they're keeping those main drivers of performance for sprinting healthy and strong. For advanced athletes, similar to the intermediate athletes, they might be using some Olympic lifts in their program. They might shift to more low box step-ups instead of higher box step-ups, so that way they can increase the load, increase the specificity of the range of motion that they're applying the load. They might include really heavy isometrics, more intense hops, and plyometrics, and once again include hamstring, hip, and calf exercises, so that way we're staying healthy and staying strong holistically. When it comes to specific development exercises for these different groups of athletes, beginner athletes, instead of using a sled, they might do a hill sprint, or they might sprint into a headwind. We don't need to go to the more intense and more complex movements and exercises with these athletes, so use what nature gave you. Run up a hill, run into the wind. They don't need to use sleds. Once you become more of an intermediate athlete, maybe that's where you do use sleds, a weight vest, or parachute sprints. But even then, if you're an intermediate athlete, say you're in the middle of high school, you've been training for a few years, you can still benefit from doing hill sprints. But if the coach brings out a sled, use it because you've developed your body to a point where you can handle that. A beginner athlete is not going to know what to do when you hook up a sled to them, so I would leave that sort of thing, that more complex type of training, off to the side and instead focus on things that are a little more simple with those beginner athletes. Both beginner and intermediate athletes can benefit from doing things like speed endurance, but one difference between them might be that the beginner athlete does crouch starts without blocks, and the more intermediate athlete does them with blocks. Because, if you've been training for a little while and you know how to use blocks, yeah, you should use them in your training program. But if you've never competed before, you've never done track before, just do a crouch start. You don't need to make it more complex by adding the blocks. Both of these groups of athletes can benefit from doing things like flying sprints as well. The specific development exercises probably don't vary a whole lot between different groups of athletes, but it's more about what percentage of their program is taken up by these SDEs. That's what's going to vary a lot between intermediate, advanced, and beginner athletes. With the more advanced athletes, you might bring in more, fancy types of training like contrasts. So whereas maybe the beginner athlete just did hill sprints one day to work on acceleration, a more advanced athlete might be contrasting between a really heavy sled pull and then an unresisted acceleration. So that way they're working on, say, generating a lot of horizontal force in that sled pull, and then they go into the acceleration, so that way they can bring that quality of force production into the more specific exercise, and then try to see some transfer from the sled to the sprint. Similarly, with max velocity work, maybe you do some contrast there. You could sprint into the wind and then sprint with the wind. You could wear a parachute on one rep and then sprint without the parachute on the next rep. Those are things that you can incorporate with more intermediate and even more so with advanced athletes once they find that just doing pure sprint training, just unresisted training, is no longer really working for them. That's where you can bring in these more complex methods of training, different training tools, and progress training that way. Another difference between intermediate and advanced athletes might be where an intermediate athlete is only going to come out of blocks in an unresisted manner, but a more advanced athlete might need to work on doing block starts with resistance. So they might use an Exergenie 1080 sprint or one of those fancy sleds that can go over blocks, so they can do block starts while having some resistance, which is going to help them generate more force and hopefully be able to apply that increased horizontal force when they sprint without the sled. Because all these athletes we're talking about are sprinters, the competitive exercise is going to be the same. If they're a 100-meter dash athlete, the competitive exercise is the 100-meter dash from blocks. If they're a shot put athlete, their competitive exercise is going to be a shot put with the competitive weight. So competitive exercises, it's a pretty simple category because it's pretty much one thing or a couple things if you only have a couple events. You can do these in your training, but the bulk of your training program is probably going to be made up of these other categories of exercises. And then toward the end of the year, when you're really specifying your training and really just want to hone that one thing you do, maybe that's when you do some competitive exercises in your program. But that's also where competition can be used as a training or as a part of your training. Say you're working in 100-meter dash sprints in competition into your program as part of your training week. You can still, even if it's in a competition, consider that part of the training program. So that's where that 5 to 10% of competitive exercises might come into play, is when you start competing and you incorporate that as part of the overall load in your training program, rather than doing 100-meter dash sprints from blocks in practice every week. You could do it, it's totally up to you, but it's probably not as common as breaking up the sprints into either shorter sprints or longer sprints, and then leaving the competition for where you're doing the competitive exercise. So just to recap a bit, in general with athletes, if you're a beginner athlete, you're going to be doing more general work. Intermediate and advanced athletes are going to be doing more specific work and more intense work. As you progress through your career as an athlete, that's where you're going to see that shift toward more intense and specific work, and the general work is going to be maintained just as a way to maintain basic fundamental qualities of physical capability, mobility, and all that stuff. You want to maintain your health. You can't lift maximally every day. You can't sprint maximally every day, but you also don't want to necessarily rest and do nothing on days where you're not sprinting at max velocity or something like that. So general prep exercises are still going to be useful for you no matter what level that you're at. As you progress as an athlete, or as your athletes progress, that's where more complex methods of training can be incorporated, more fancy training tools can be used, but you don't want to jump the gun and go too quick into, including complex methods into your programs, because if the athlete doesn't need it and they'll benefit from simply doing really general exercises, you might be limiting their ability to improve in the long run if you bring highly specific and high intensity exercises into their training program too early. Once you really go for high intensity training or really highly specific training, it's hard to go back to general training and then expect to have a similar improvement when you bring back that specific training again. So once you kind of go beyond general training, you have to be really careful about when you do that, because it's hard to come back from that, and some people might progress really well earlier in their career and flatline. Oftentimes that's because they intensified their training too early and it left them with nowhere to go as they continued to develop and mature as an athlete. So whether you're a young athlete, you're an old athlete, or somewhere in between, hopefully this can help you figure out kind of a general idea of how different types of exercises might fit in your program, how to progress those over time, and give you ideas of, what this might look like for 3 different types of athletes based on their experience level. Thank you guys for tuning in. I really appreciate it. Make sure to check out the links below. I got some programs down there. Leave a thumbs up, leave a comment, and subscribe in case you haven't. If you have topics that you'd want me to cover in future videos, leave them below in a comment and I'll do my best to get to them at some point. But until next time, guys, this is Cody Bidlow with SprintingWorkouts.com, signing off.